a researcher named Anthony Sanchez. How many people in here have read UFO Highway? Maybe 7. I'm going to share this morning with you some information from him, but I would like to recommend that he and I are talking about how we can do a lot more work on his book that appeared in 2010 and 2011. He had 2 updated editions. And you can't find this book today. He thinks, and other people think, that it was vacuumed up. And so I feel it is important, but this is really heavy duty. This goes so much further than anything I have presented to you. And I want to go this next step a little ways, and then I want to take your Q&A. But I want you to know that Anthony and I are going to do a lot more work, and I'm going to have a tremendous amount of material at earthfiles.com, because this month in my August Coast to Coast AM, a Dreamland, and a series that I'm going to unfold at Earth Files, I will be on the last Thursday of this month for 3 hours, and I'm going to make at least 2 half hours from the interview. What I'm going to share this morning is not edited, but it is a segment that I think is extremely important. It relates to Helen Luttrell. It relates to everything that I've shared with you in the first workshop and the lecture. The focus of this, we've been in Nevada. We're talking about hybrids underground in a vast installation at Area 51, not too far from Las Vegas. And now we're going to move to northern New Mexico and the notorious Dulce. And all of us have heard about underground levels at Dulce going back to the early 1980s. Nobody has ever been able to prove it. There have been several substantive whistleblowers. The strongest said that he had worked as a security guard named Thomas C., who talked with his girlfriend, who talked with John Lear. That goes back to the mid-'80s, the famous story that the security guard had snuck out some videotape and photographs of these different levels where gray extraterrestrials were mixing and matching genes to make all kinds of life forms. And nobody believed it then. Nobody had any context to believe it. I was very dubious, but Dulce never went away. And where we're going to go now, even if it has to remain in the anonymous source level, it is another U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel that gave the download to Anthony Sanchez. And let's right now just look at a map. The red circle is Dulce. It's 85 miles northeast of Farmington in Aztec, where there was another very important craft retrieval back in March of 1948, we think. It's very close to the Colorado border, where on the other side of the border is one of 2 Archuleta mesas that cross the New Mexico-Colorado border there. And this is where, allegedly, there are many levels underground that include extraterrestrial territories where genetic experimentation, cloning, and hybridization programs are ongoing. For the first time, talking with Anthony, it came into focus when he said that the colonel introduced to the underground hybridization program in the 70s, like the first colonel was brought into the humanization program in Nevada in 1956. that he got the clear understanding in his briefing that all of the underground installations under Dulce had been there for thousands, perhaps millions of years. The opening quote of the book is by a U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel X that Anthony Sanchez interviewed about the colonel's work in this other ET human hybrid project underground, the Archuleta Mesas near Dulce, New Mexico. He told Anthony, quote, "If you had told me half the things we would read in those briefing documents that I saw, I would have said you were insane," close quote. Now, the background, briefly, is that on January 6, 2010, in Placer County, California, between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe, that Anthony Sanchez conducted a confidential interview with a retired United States Air Force lieutenant colonel regarding a classified incident that took place in 1979 at a secret U.S. government base in Dulce, New Mexico. How can it be a government base and an extraterrestrial long-time genetic program? Some of you may know or have seen some of the work by Tal Levesque. Is anybody familiar with Tal Levesque's work? Well, in the early 80s, he was a very close friend of Bill Hamilton, who was also involved in investigations, and Tal Levesque spent a lot of time with me showing me documents. And perhaps the most important thing that Tal told me was that his father, Tal Levesque's father, worked for the Department of Energy, that was the Atomic Energy Commission when we exploded the bombs, and that it is the AEC and the Navy that have all of the really hot material from all of the evolution of this government on extraterrestrial matters, and that they have used the Air Force and the Army and intel agencies, and that redirects the American taxpayer's mind away from where the true source of all the material that we want to see. It's always been under the U.S. Navy and the Atomic Energy Commission, as they have changed names and assignments and special access projects. They were the original ones, and they have most of what we want. And according to this lieutenant colonel, he was assigned to a Dulce Special Medical Detachment in 1979. So 56 on Colonel Nadine, this colonel gets to Dulce in 1979. Quote, "Due to the enigmatic nature surrounding the UFO phenomenon and the potentially adverse consequences of publicly disclosing highly classified information, the colonel has been granted anonymity," close quote. That's what Anthony. And this is why this is so difficult. The classifications of this kind of information is because the government thinks that none of us can handle any of this, right? And that people have been killed over and over and over in the 50s, the 60s, and at least some of the 70s, who had information like what I'm sharing with you this morning, and they were killed to keep it from reaching the public. And then, somewhere in the early 80s, I was told that policy began to change. One time I was at a conference, and I never saw the man's face. I had been speaking, it was, I think, Eureka Springs, and I was feeling I started to say attacked, and that's not quite right. I was feeling like I was being impinged by all kinds of indirect, heavy-duty pressure on me to stop everything I was doing. And I had said that out loud at the conference, that I was concerned about myself and other people investigating something that I, as an American journalist, felt that I had every right in the world to try to keep going, to understand what other life forms there could be in the universe, and why our government would have such a severe policy of denial about it, and why in the United States, growing up as an American, I should feel that my life was threatened in investigating matters that the government denied were even existing. But I did feel threatened. A lot of people felt threatened. And at that conference, a man ran up when I was surrounded by a whole bunch of people that were asking me questions. And I felt his air, I felt the heat of his voice in my right ear. And he said, I know that you are worried about whether you will survive. I know that you are worried about what the government could do. I'm here to tell you, don't worry, keep going and doing what you're doing. And he was gone. Well, it's Deus ex machina, dropping out of the sky in human form, but none of us have any guarantees. Anthony Sanchez has no guarantees. He's really been rumbled. And his book that came out in 2010 and 2011 has basically disappeared. It says to me, this is a book with a lot of truth, but I want you to know, as much as I've been exposed to, UFO Highway is heavy duty. It is really, really heavy duty. And I'm going to go so far with the idea that Anthony and I are going to be working on doing a whole bunch more. Hopefully, we're going to be left alone to do it. So,
living amongst us is an alien-human hybrid race. Long time ago, there was a group called the progenitors that came to our solar system. They inhabited Mars until something cataclysmic happened on Mars. It forced them underground on Mars, and after several thousand years, they made their way to Earth. Earth was not necessarily the ideal place for their genetic makeup. It posed a lot of difficulties for them. These progenitors started to modify their genetic makeup and subsequently bred offspring that had a better chance at surviving on Earth. Over time, these offspring were forced to interbreed with humans. These alien-human hybrids still exist to this day. They carry a genetic component that shows their alien origins. Not all humans have this alien origin. It's very confusing because all modern humans have been genetically modified. This is why we saw these exponential levels in our evolution. By comparison to other animals on this planet, no other animal has evolved at the level that humans have. This is because some 250,000 years ago, we were genetically modified so that we would become upright, highly intelligent, and capable of working for these aliens. Prior to that point, we were not capable of servicing these aliens. These aliens created a subcaste called Greys, Igigis. So when I'm talking about the progenitors, I'm referring to the Anunnaki. Now, the alien-human hybrid group that exists today, these are the descendants of the Anunnaki.
Okay, now the Anunnaki, in terms of what was carved in stone, were depicted as being much taller than, we'll call them normal, classic Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens sapien as they are depicted in the stone. And the very tall so-called Sumerian gods wore ropey headdresses, had on some type of robe, and often carried a rod in one of their hands that in the last 30 years or so has been defined by several people in military and other whistleblowers as being a communication technology for the telepathic communication of the once Sumerian gods to the Homo sapiens sapien. And that is what was translated into the so-called royal bloodlines of the scepter and the ball. did either the first interview in 2008 in the abandoned parking lot, or when you finally get to talk with the colonel, these men give you a timeline in which the progenitors left Mars and arrived at Earth. What time in Earth's timeline did the progenitors start creating greys, various standing up primates, and so forth?
The colonel gave me the timeline. So, my understanding, well, the information that I received from the colonel is that this progenitor group left the Sirius system for our own, okay?
Right.
This is a long time ago. And they arrived, let me make sure I'm telling you this correctly, and I'm not editing. 1 million years ago, they arrived to our solar system. For 100,000 years, they lived on Mars. Mars, there was this cataclysmic event that affected Mars. I believe it was asteroids. It affected the atmosphere. So 900,000 years later, they came to Earth. And during that entire time, they struggled to survive on Earth. And about 250,000 years ago, the progenitors themselves actually died away. And it was their descendants who the colonel referred to as the Australbus, which are essentially the descendants of these Anunnaki progenitors, began to thrive on Earth. They also created the Greys at that point, referred to as the Igigi, or the Aloha Greys, the Aloha. Now, they were created as a subcaste, which was, they shared no genetic DNA, they had no genetic makeup with the progenitors. All of the genetic factors in creating the Greys was sourced through alien genetic materials, and it wasn't until much later that the Greys used Earth-based genetic materials to continue propagating. 250,000 years ago, it coincided with, many things culminated at the 250,000 year mark, which was the Greys began to essentially manage humans, the progenitors died off, the Australbus remained, and humans were genetically modified to begin servicing both the Greys and these Anunnaki offspring.
Were defined as what physically?
They were the first Anunnaki-human hybrid. That was something they never wanted to do. The progenitors, when they began modifying their own genetic makeup so that subsequent generations would be able to survive on Earth, they never intended to interbreed with humans. They never intended to borrow DNA from humans. It wasn't until much later, when subsequent generations of Anunnaki continued to die off, that they realized they needed to incorporate a human genetic component in their own genome and their own genetic structure so that they could survive. And those alien-human hybrids, those are the descendants of the Anunnaki. Those are the Australbus.
What do they look like?
They look just like you and me. Where they differ is they carry a genetic component that clearly shows their alien origin. And they are very, very controlling about their bloodlines. They have very strict protocols about how they propagate.
Would that fit in with the whole concept of royal bloodlines?
Absolutely. Royal bloodlines and extremely wealthy bloodlines.
Do they have any specific physical characteristics?
None that I'm aware of, because my understanding is that they have successfully propagated around the planet, and there's no specific physical trait that sets them apart from humans. There are Chinese, there are Latin Americans, there are Europeans that belong to this tightly controlled bloodline. It is a genetic component, and it's not necessarily limited to one specific group.
Why in your book are they referenced in relationship to the interview with the colonel as being, quote, light bringers or Illumina?
I think that has to do with the fact that over time, these groups have emerged, these secret societies have emerged, and one of them being the Illuminati. And the groups essentially refer to some of the symbolism behind the origins that ultimately culminated into the names that they use for their groups.
Are they tall blondes?
I believe so. My understanding, Linda, is that there are multiple bloodlines.
Why the Astra albus have had tightly controlled bloodlines of their alien origin stretching back for at least 250,000 years.
Well, for one practical purpose. Once they refined the hybridization process, they had to be very careful as to not disturb that process so they didn't cause anomalies that would result in the same patterns that were seen with their predecessors.
The ones that got sick and died away.
Correct.
And what was the heart of their disease?
It had to do with the atmosphere, Earth's atmosphere. Earth's atmosphere was not conducive to their genetic makeup.
Any other specific medical problem?
Yes. There was unexpected changes in the Earth's environment, mostly greater levels of radiation from the sun that began to corrupt their DNA. So essentially their salvation would come through splicing their own genes with humans to produce a new species capable of successfully interbreeding. The Astra albus essentially created many generations of humans before finally achieving the one that they would accept and be able to breed with naturally. That is the modern human. That is one of the reasons why they created us initially.
If the Astra albus produced genetically both the greys and the evolving standing up primates from Homo erectus up to Cro-Magnon, Homo sapien sapien, to do work for them, to serve them in some capacity on the earth, why is it that the gray made by the Astra albus would end up cooperating with Homo sapien sapien that the greys were supposed to manage?
25,000 years ago, the Anunnaki put the greys on the other side of the planet in the hopes that they would die off. In fact, they infected them with a disease that was designed to kill them and die in the hopes that they would die off. The progenitors warned their offspring that the greys could eventually become a threat to them. And they did at one point. According to the Colonel and the archaeological tablets that were discovered in Dulce, at one point, humans were worshiping the greys, the Igigi. And the Anunnaki descendants saw this, they put a stop to it, and they tricked the greys, essentially, into putting them on the other side of the planet, which is modern-day Dulce.
So, I'm still learning, so I'm a student with you. This and we need the big screens and that I could use pointers, but I'll try to no. So where did the progenitors come from? They came from Sirius AB. What did the Dogon tribe in Africa shock the African missionary people or the professors that went there with all of their detailed knowledge about the astronomical interactions of Sirius A and B that we knew nothing about in the 1800s? And you all, you know what I'm talking about. I'm assuming now you guys have read the Sirius Mystery and that you are familiar with the fact that in the 1800s, this was shocking information. It was buried in a French scientific journal, and ultimately, 15 years ago, the Sirius Mystery was published. What is the author's name again? Who? Templeton, that's right. Temple, Robert Temple. Yeah. And it is a very important book. If you have not read The Sirius Mystery, it is, in funny, strange way, it is the first bead in this story, meaning that it would explain why a very small tribe, the Dogon tribe in Africa, for the last hundreds of years, would have had detailed astronomical information about Sirius A and B that our astronomers had no knowledge about until we got into the 20th century. So now, this Air Force Lieutenant Colonel is establishing that Sirius A and B is the source of progenitors, that's his word, that traveled to Mars in this solar system 1 million years ago. I realize that as I say these words, I sound like I'm describing a script from Star Trek. But it's my understanding from long ago when I was working on the HBO project, I was told that Gene Roddenberry was taken into some of the MJ-12 confidences and that Star Trek was put together absolutely on purpose with backing from people working in MJ-12 on the extraterrestrial challenge so that the general world audience would be exposed to all of these bizarre concepts through a TV program where it would all be safe and entertaining. So follow through with me and try to go into a nonfiction mode in your mind that we are now talking about the true history of the solar system and the planet.
Are the progenitors Anunnaki?
Here, I'm going to try to go down the list as I understand it so far. And remember, this is August 11th. I hope by the last week in August I will be able to do this much, much more and more coherently. My understanding is that the Syrians 1 million years ago go to Mars. The colonel calls them progenitors. They live on Mars and probably are the ones responsible for Cydonia and the face that NASA and company have tried to convince us is a sandhill of light and shadow, that it actually was the representation of something, that was a complex, that there are all kinds of complexes on Mars, and that the progenitors lived there for 100,000 years, and then there was an asteroid impact that destroyed much, but they were able to get some kind of an exodus to the next planet over that had a lot of water, and that was Earth. But when they got here, they had a tremendous amount of problems with the atmosphere and the gravity of Earth, and that this led to, because they were obviously capable of doing genetic hybridization, that they began mixing and matching genes on this planet, trying to find a way to survive their own deterioration and extinction. And that they made grays that they called ELOAH, very close to Elohim, and they ended up later on making a series of standing up primates from already evolving primates that ended up being us, and that they made a group, when they made the grays, they made Astro albus, which may be, that's the question. What is the Astro albus? They are described as being white. The Astro albus was the closest to the original Sirius AB progenitors. It was their way of trying to build something that would extend their life into it, and then the progenitors went extinct. The Astro albus is what survived and was what became, with the Greys, the creators of the Sumerian gods in what we call Mesopotamia. That, I think, are the rapid cycle cloned beings with the large nose, the vertical pupils, the ropey headdress, carrying the rod that is drawn in the meeting in 1964 on Earth at Holloman Air Force Base. I think these are one and the same. The Astro albus would have the ability to also do this rapid cycle cloning and extend whatever its need for human form, or we'll call it the archeloid form, so that they could sustain life on Earth. In human literature, the closest in history we get back to joining up with this Lieutenant Colonel Air Force description of the true history of what is behind this exodus from Sirius to Mars to Earth are the Igigi. How many people have studied the Igigi? 4 or 5. We all need to do a lot of homework. And the Ijiji, I have read, and it's quite fascinating. But when you read the IGIGI, that's what it is, IGIGI. Go Google, start with Google. Just put that word in and you'll see what comes up. Remember that we have the problem that our education and our website, they are tracking the official Harvard, Oxford interpretation that civilization began 5,000 years ago. And you have to now start setting all of that aside, and you have to start trying with an open mind to at least look at this and this book, which we will hopefully get more of and get it out there, that there is this huge history before 5,000. 5,000 is a tiny scratch on this huge iceberg. And that all of the terraforming and the mythology of Plato and Herodotus about Atlantis is probably describing these efforts by the original Syrians to Mars, to Earth, trying to find a way to survive on another planet. What we do not know is what was the original problem on Sirius that sent the progenitors. And the other question that I ask Anthony Sanchez that I think is vital: who is the enemy of the progenitors? He has no idea. This whole issue of extraterrestrial territorial conflicts is the key to so much. And it is so hidden in this game of changing the external forms and the clones and the hybrids, and we cannot tell the players without some sort of infrared technology. But the Ijiji and the Anunnaki, I believe, are the same, and I believe the Ijiji and the Anunnaki were made by rapid cycle cloning, and that they are one and the same as the character behind the Ebens at the meeting at Holloman Air Force Base. Another very important part out of the Lieutenant Colonel, it's a very important, a very long book. You're just getting a teeny, teeny piece. But how many people have read Holy Blood, Holy Grail? Good, 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 good. That's a very important book. You have to go to the back footnotes. I think it's the 3rd page from the end, where I wrote notes when I got the book on its first printing back in the 80s. And in the back footnotes, it says, Merovingians thought to be extraterrestrials coming from a reptilian bloodline. A reptilian bloodline is the Anunnaki. Zechariah Sitchin and I had long conversations about this in person, that the Anunnaki were scaled. They wore the ropey headdress, they wore the long robes, but they were scaled. They had vertical pupils. Another government guy said to me, I realize I'm treading into a little dangerous ground here, but I think that if we're ever going to understand a true history, that we have to face, that we have to use some names and words that might be nitroglycerin in the political arena of this world now in order to even understand what is happening on the planet right now in 2014. A government guy said, you know that part in the Bible where Abraham gets upset because one of his sons comes into the tent? And the words are that Abraham does not want his son to see his body. The government guy said to me, it's because Abraham was one of the last in which the scales of the reptile were on the surface of the skin. And that they learned how, through hybridization and cloning, to make human form that would not have the scales on the outside. and that the bloodline from Abraham down to Noah is that. From Noah, the bottleneck, historically in terms of the literature, we are all the product and not be the product of anything except Noah. We know that's not true because there have been extraterrestrials, at least 3 competing groups that have been using the planet for 270 million years. So this is not the only story. What the Anthony Sanchez UFO Highway finally is bringing into focus for me is that Earth had been being used for 270 million years. We don't know. We don't have a timeline handed to us about when something traveled from Sirius to Mars, had problems, and came to Earth and had problems. But let's assume that Earth was being terraformed and harvested by other extraterrestrial civilizations. The entry of the Sirius exodus from Mars would have been another geopolitical territorial pawn on the Earth chessboard. This may be where all of these conflicts and descriptions of a long-going war between the Ebens and the tall blondes, that seems to be a common denominator, that is part of the issue. What is allowable to do with life? What is allowable to do with hybrids and cloning? We don't have those answers, but suddenly I'm beginning to see how you can get conflict between extraterrestrials if there is an exodus from a solar system or within a solar system that ends up on a planet where something else is already working. Then, out of the Sumerian Mesopotamian source, that big, huge node on this planet for so long has been this area that has been largely desert, not always, moments of water. The Sphinx has had rain on it, but largely desert. And it's my understanding that the Eben types have to be in some sort of warmer air, and that the Nordics hate warm air. They want it colder, just like we want air conditioning or not. So there is some sort of a beginning to have a gestalt of different life forms with different needs that are on a planet, and they are all trying to come up with what they want, what they need, and they collide with each other. And that the whole concept of the Mesopotamian group, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the Merovingians being an extraterrestrial bloodline that was reptilian. Where did that Merovingian bloodline go? If Jim Mars were here, he could give you another 3 hours on that. His Rule by Secrecy book is vital. Rule by Secrecy, what was it about? That the Merovingians coming with vis-a-vis the Anunnaki in Mesopotamia, they end up going into Europe, and that the Chateau Lorraine with that gigantic 5-star, I'm going to call it landscaping geometry, like the first huge crop formation, only it's a land formation, and it's in France, and it is real. It is a 5-pointed star. It is superimposed on the Rennes-le-Chateau geography. And from Jim's point of view, that is Merovingian, that is extraterrestrial, that is marking territory. The royal bloodlines with their blue blood are the Merovingians. Just keep that in your head. The royal bloodlines, doesn't matter which country, was an effort on the part of these Astro-Albus to keep their blood that had originated on Sirius and all of the problems that they had in trying to sustain life here. And they propped it up through the Eloah, the Greys, and the Astro-Albus that they made, trying to basically project a civilization into new forms of life on a new planet. at least the DNA would be extended. And as Crick said when I talked about that part of the panspermia, and David Wilcock has talked about it in his book, Synchronicity is the Key, that right now, for the very first time on Earth, DNA scientists and others are finding that if they take a certain frequency, a certain resonance, and apply it to light or water under certain conditions, that something akin to a double helix molecule of DNA will automatically emerge from the right frequency applied to either light or water. That would suggest if this is real, then this universe is made, is programmed to interact in water and light to produce the double helix DNA. And that means whether you're on Sirius or Earth or 7 billion light years away or at the end of the universe, where there is life, it is going to be a DNA molecule of some sort. Meaning that there is a self-activating software in this universe that is always waiting, ready to be activated by resonance and frequency. And that all of these stone circles that go back in time, if Michael Tellinger is right, at 250,000 years, and all of those strange animal characters on the very bizarre Göbekli Tepe, they could have been machines that were related to the hybridization program that was involved in making the Eloah, the Greys, and the Astro Albus. We would be the, as that one DIA guy said to me, we would be the 37th model of a Hoover vacuum cleaner that had been made over the time since the Astro Albus, the Merovingians, the evolution of that type trying to get their own geopolitical control on Earth. All these roly-poly primates are coming up, but they haven't got a clue about any of this superstructure of other intelligences that are not only made them, but are engineering the whole planet and probably have underground facilities right now on Mars, which maybe we've discovered. Maybe we are on Mars collaborating with Astro Albuses right now. And that it's not science fiction. The royal bloodlines down to Queen Elizabeth and the new little baby boy, they are what the original Syrians who ran into trouble, who had to escape Mars, who get to Earth, find it's very difficult to live here the way they were made, and they've got to transfer their civilization onto something that will sustain, that the bloodline issue that we've run into in abductions, the bloodline issue of the Merovingians moving into Europe, the bloodline issues behind Illuminati. That was a word I always have tried to stay away from, and suddenly in the Lieutenant Colonel, the Air Force Lieutenant Colonel that Anthony has interviewed and is saying that Astro Albus in his briefing was translated as Illumini or white. The Illuminati in this definition, and as far as Anthony Sanchez is concerned, the colonel was stressing the Illuminati is the bloodline of the Astro Albus on this planet trying to sustain an elite Astro Albus control through royal bloodlines in the barter system. Right now in 2014, 1% of this planet is running, manipulating, and controlling 99%. And the rest of us wonder what's wrong with this picture. So I personally feel that Homo sapien deserves to know what we really are.